All right, Quintin. First of all, congratulations. You are a new father. It's, I believe, 1 week old today. Is that correct?
Yeah, 1 week.
Yeah. So I know you're not one to talk about your personal too much, but congratulations. That's a big one.
Thanks. It's been great.
Yeah. So I just want to throw that in there. But yeah. Today we've got some good stuff to go over. Pull up the screen here. We're gonna start with plyometrics. We had a question about plyometrics.
Yeah, let's hear it.
All right, so the question is, I'd appreciate advice on plyo. Should I be using hurdles, box jumps, just skipping? How should I use air assault bike for sprinting? Ab ball exercises I got figured out. My back feels better now than the last decade. Thanks. Yeah, I agree. The ball exercises are awesome. The ab exercises on the ball are awesome. But yeah, let's jump into that plyo.
Okay.
First of all, let's start with this last one since I know we've addressed this in another episode. The assault bike. I'll pull up some videos of just plyo in general. But what are your thoughts on the assault bike in general, and maybe other cardio equipments for plyometrics specifically?
So cardio equipment for plyo. Oh, so
Or for sprint training?
for sprint training, that's interesting. I guess it would depend on the type of event, because each event is going to be slightly different, like a 200 meter, 400 meter, 100 meter. Um, Let me think about this. So if you want to, let's say, improve your endurance for a sprinting event with a cardio machine, is that what he's asking?
Yeah, they're asking. I, I mean, I think at the core of their question, they're trying to get more explosive, and so they're asking about hurdles, box jumps, and skipping. But then they threw the assault bike in there, and I think they're just wondering about the assault bike for sprinting in general, for explosive output in general. I might throw in there like sprinting on a treadmill, like really ramping the speed up. Like, how would you incorporate that into your sprint training? The machines, if you're tight on space.
Oh, the machines. Okay, so oh man, that's kind of a tough one. So let's
I know
say,
you're into the rower. You do the rower and the bike. Those are your two of choice.
yeah, those are the two things that I would probably prioritize. So we'll go we'll go with what I would do with like a 100 meter, then with what we would do with say like a 200 meter event and a 400 meter. Because I have trained a hurdler, and he was like a 400 meter hurdler, and we were doing some areas because he was struggling with like the last 100 meters, which is always the hardest. When you do 400 meter hurdles, 200 meter hurdles, it's usually the last endpoint of the race is when you're most depleted on anaerobic and you're about to kick into aerobic. So this could really depend on what's going on with the athlete. Unfortunately, there's not a simple answer. So we would have to first you need a cardio test. We need to figure out what's going on with your energy systems. Now there's a bunch of different types of cardio tests you can do. You can do a cardio test on, you can pick up any random VO2 max test on the internet, utilizing an assault bike, utilizing a row machine, or, you can do the Cooper's test, which is a 12-minute run, tracking how much ground you cover in 12 minutes and your heart rate. You can put those numbers in a Cooper's test calculator. It's free all over the internet, and you can get an approximation of what's going on with your energy system zones. Once we have those results, then we can try to identify which part of the energy system might be deficient. That could be affecting your ability to have good anaerobic endurance for your race. Maybe it's your ATP system is really strong, but kicking over to your anaerobic system, maybe that kick over is a little lacking. Or maybe your ATP system is strong, your anaerobic is weak, but your aerobic is really strong, your long distance. So once we identify which gear in your energy system has deficiency, then we can start implementing a cardio program to redevelop that gear, which will help aid in your endurance for sprinting. Now, which tool to use for sprinting? I'm not exactly sure what would be more effective between the assault bike or say like a row machine. I would lean towards the assault bike just because of the amount of RPMs you can pump out might be a little faster than, say, the row machine. But I don't know. I guess it has its pros and cons because assault bike is very anterior leg dominant, which isn't always the best. Because if you ever went through an assault bike, like Tabata training, some sort of crazy interval training, like a lot of times your quadriceps will feel pumped up because it forces that anterior leg drive, into the bike and into the pedals. So you kind of neglect the posterior and you kind of neglect the core with assault bike because your core is not active, your glutes are shut down, you're in a seated position. The advantages with the row machine is that it's more total body, where you can start training from the toes all the way to the neck. Everything is involved with the row machine, but it is a little slower to maybe hit that anaerobic output. Maybe. I don't know. I've never worked with enough track guys to fully understand which cardio machine would go best. Now that I'm kind of talking out loud, I'll probably say the row machine because getting the core involved, at least getting the glutes involved, I think that'll have more perks to it. And so, oh man, once you have these test numbers, the cardio program can vary a lot. Like, depending if which energy system might be deficient. So maybe you'd have to double down on aerobic training if your aerobic system is not very efficient. Or maybe if your anaerobic system, your ATP system is really high, but your anaerobic system is really low, or your anaerobic system could be not putting out the way you want it to. It could be an indication that your aerobic system can't recharge your muscles with ATP properly. You have a circulatory issue. And this is really common with high anaerobic, like MMA fighters, guys that are usually like black, fast twitch, like Israel Adesanya or like Anthony Roble-Johnson. They probably have great output when it comes to like a 100-meter dash, but probably when you get into the 200, 400 meter, sometimes it can drop off because naturally their aerobic system might be a little bit more deficient and the type of muscle fibers they have might want to favor their ATP system more than, say, supporting the aerobic system. So it can be pretty complex. It can go, this kind of question can be answered in so many different directions. So I would say what you'd want to do first is do a cardio test to see if there's a deficiency. And then, how about this? If he can find a deficiency, if he can tell us what his numbers are, then I can properly answer this for him and give him like an idea of which direction to head. If you don't want to do that and you just want to kind of mess around with some modalities to see if you can get like a little bit of benefit, I would probably try to find a way to duplicate your events. So if it's a 400 meter, that's usually like between let's say an average is like 60 seconds to run 400 meters. Some people are doing it better than others. I would probably do something along the lines of, a huge 60-second sprint on the row machine with a light resistance, and you're just trying to rip that thing as hard as you can for 60 seconds, giving it everything you got. And then maybe give yourself like a 5-minute break, and then hit it again. And then another 5-minute break, and then hit it again. So you're kind of building up a better lactic acid tolerance for something that's more specific for your event. And you can apply this principle, say, to like your 100-meter dash, your 200-meter dash, or your 400-meter dash. That will give you some slight benefits, that will really help the conditioning process. But that's not as refined as getting exact numbers.
Yeah, it's all context dependent. We keep coming back to that, and yeah. So please, anyone listening, like if you're sending your question, like we're trying to take into context what are your weaknesses, and then also what are the specific requirements of your event. So if you're doing fights with 5-minute rounds, you probably want to be doing 5-minute sets, sprints, intermittent sprints for 5 minutes, that kind of thing.
It's a good start. That's a good starting point. It won't give you the absolute best results. It'll probably give you like maybe a good 30% increase in your cardio. But if you want like, really great cardio confidence, you got to get testing. We got to find numbers. and we got to program and periodize it properly into your program. And that could be a little bit of a process.
Yeah, yeah, and you need some self awareness to understand where you're, or some guidance to understand where
Mm-hmm.
you're weak relative to your competition.
Yeah.
All right, so and then just again, so it's hard to get into the general of it, but we talked about sprinting and kind of the cardio aspect, um, the endurance aspect of the sprinting. What about just the explosive aspect of plyometrics? What are your theories on let's just say for fighters, since they didn't specify, and we're mostly talking about fighters here. How would you incorporate plyometrics into training with most fighters? Do you do a lot of this type of jump training, hurdles, anything like that? Um, how do you program for fighters?
Oh, okay. Depending on the fight date, will kind of determine when we'll start tapering, when we'll start pushing them into plyometrics. I also like to do things in phases, like having a general preparation phase, having like a strength foundation phase, and then going into like the main course of the training program. It tends to have a really synergistic effect on the body. And I learned this process. Oh, wait, click that video with that guy on the swing. Yes. This is super old school. This is super old school.
Oh,
Somebody
it's like a
really
super
did it.
cat. It's like a super cat.
Exactly. So this is wow. That's so cool. Someone duplicated this shit. This is like from the fucking 50s. So this was the first super cat idea back in like the 50s or 60s, like during the Cold War. But hold on, we'll get into that in a second. So you want to push this into like three phases in general. Like the first phase is how I program this in is first I want to redevelop their neuromuscular efficiency. I want to rebuild their feet and rebuild their fascial and muscle tendon elasticity. And a lot of it's done with the foot strengthening exercises and the ball work training. Now, before we get into that, we would like, if it's possible, to run an athletic assessment on the athlete, figure out what their strengths and weaknesses are. That will really kind of like trim the fat off of the program so we can really target very specific things for him. But if we can't do that, we might do a more general idea. So that's usually phase one. Repairing weak links, physical therapy if they need it. And the ball work training is also really good at highlighting weaknesses. Like, say, if they can't do certain exercises like the kickbacks, rotational kickbacks, that'll really give me an idea that, okay, we don't have proper hamstring development, nervous system isn't communicating with the internal external rotators very well. These are areas where the athlete can start leaking rate of force developments. And then once we've rebuilt the nervous system with the ball work training, we rebuilt the elasticity so that their tissue is more reactive and elastic, and we rebuilt the feet, then we want to get into like a heavy strength foundation phase. We're going to be pushing a lot of isometric strength training into the athletes, like a lot, overcoming isometrics, push isometrics, resisting isometrics. And what I want to do is I want to increase, well, one, I want to get the tendons and ligaments a lot healthier, developing like a good thickness and blood flow into those ligaments. And then I also want to develop a better strength foundation with the ISO by recruiting more muscle fibers. Getting the nervous system to grab as many muscle fibers to hold like some time under tension as best as possible. All this lays a really solid foundation for improving velocity. I probably won't go into any sort of heavy weightlifting or compounded movements or Olympic weightlifting because one, that creates a lot of stiffness and a lot of tension into the body. It's very hard on the nervous system. It takes a while for it to recover. We can lose training capacity. And it's not as sports specific. The joint angles you get with Olympic bars and squat bars and stuff like that are super limited because you have to balance the bar on your back. You can't get into like any sort of running stance. You can't hit a good hip extension on the forefoot. The tool really limits the sequencing of muscles we can strengthen and how the foot interacts with the ground, how we want to strengthen it. And so once we go through the isometric phase, sometimes that can last like 1 week, 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, depending on what our timeline is, for say an upcoming fight. And then all this phase one and phase two is preparing the athlete's body for plyometrics. Because if there's a lot of weaknesses or imperfections in the biomechanics, knee valgus, collapsed arches, they can't rebound off of the floor very well, the plyometrics isn't going to be that effective and can actually start working against them. It could be too hard on, say, like their knees, their hips, their ankles, the lower back. We don't want to make the athlete worse. So once we have the body refined and is prepared for in phase 1 and phase 2, then going into phase 3, this is where we can start implementing heavier plyometric training. And I usually start it out with good jump training. Now, there's a difference between jump training and plyometrics, according to Dr. Yessis, the guy who coined the term. So jump training is what exactly as it sounds. It's just training proper jump mechanics, learning how to like swing your arms properly. And let's go to that one guy. Save this video. I want to come back to this, but let's go back to the guy in like the purple singlet because he shows some really good examples. Yeah. So this is depth drop plyometrics. Now these hurdle hops, this is jump training. And technically, I guess that could be a form of jump training. I'm not the biggest fan of the stair hops, so I think they're okay. But when you're just doing regular jumping, this is a great way to develop your skill set. Now, this is dorsiflex jumping. I have kind of a hot take on this. I'll get to that in a second. But we're going to do different things. We're going to do hurdle hops. We're going to do lateral skater jumps. We're going to do a bunch of different exercises to teach the body how to absorb and recoil kinetic energy properly before I even have them on plyometrics. Before we add an elevation to it like a box. Now, if the jumping's looking good, they're not sticking to the floor too hard, they're recoiling, they're rebounding. Honestly, way better than this guy. This guy, he does a lot of plyometric training, but his feet are very weightlifting-based feet. He can be very flat-footed, and seems like a real big power guy. A lot of power jumps. And there's a bunch of different jumps that we're going to want for fighting. We're going to want low-level plyometrics using a 6-inch box. Teaching the extremities from the knee down how to absorb and recoil that kinetic energy much more efficiently. That's great for strength, for footwork endurance, and footwork speed. And it will also kind of save the longevity because your calves, your foot and ankle, those are the first points of contact. Those have to be the most efficient parts of your legs when you get into jumping or when you get into plyo. If those are inefficient, the amount of plyo you can do and how your body can absorb those gains are going to be severely limited. And then we get into different types of jump training, split squat jumps, skater jumps, regular hops, hurdle hops. Maybe we'll do some more dynamic things like we saw the Soviets where we'll jump and twist, but that really depends on how advanced the athlete is. Once that's looking pretty good, it's very efficient, their technique is good, the rebounding, they're elastic, it's looking really well, then we'll start adding some boxes. So there's a couple different forms of what's called shock method training. So there's jump training and then there's plyometric shock. And plyometric shock usually involves a box that's about over the height of your knees. When the box is over the height of your knees, that's when we're kind of getting more into Soviet style shock method training. And what that does is that really forces the stretch shortening cycle, the area that's responsible for force generation, that really emphasizes that stretch shortening cycle to become hyperactive and hyper strong. But there's a limitation to how many you can do. You can only do so many depth drops in a week. And every athlete's different. Some athletes can do up to 20. Some athletes can do maybe only 5 in a single training session. Then we have to wait like 5 to 8 days before we hit it again. Yeah, so this is low-level plyometrics. See it's using a small box. It primarily hits the calves, Achilles tendons, foot, and ankle. This is more jump training. Priming the body, teaching the body how to sequence and rebound properly. And then when we get into more aggressive plyometrics, when the box starts to become at like the height of their femurs to their pelvis, that's where we're in a very, I wouldn't say risky, but a very quality over quantity style methodology. And the results are absolutely phenomenal. Like when it comes to plyometrics, like if you're not doing depth drops, if you're not doing any form of plyo, like you're seriously limiting how much force you can generate in MMA. You're basically robbing yourself of becoming a serious contender in anything without this type of training. Now, some athletes can develop this type of force generation naturally. There are genetic outliers, but if we're going to be totally honest, those guys are few and far between, and most likely it's not you. You gotta stimulate the body properly. Now, this is a depth drop, and depth drops. This is also really high depth drop. I'm really cautious when we get into depth drops, anything that's higher than the lower back, because you're taking the weight of the athlete multiplied by the velocity of their moving down. That could be several hundreds of pounds of force hitting the body. And what we're doing with this is we're teaching the body to absorb and brace that energy. Landing on the forefoot, making sure that the stretch shortening cycle is working active. And this is really good for starting and stopping. And then we start getting to single leg depth drops. Let's see if he'll rebound or if he'll just drop and hold. Yeah, so he's just dropping and holding. So this is another way to condition the body to absorb force better, absorb force more efficiently. Now I don't know, he is landing a little hard. With my athletes, I want to take their shoes off because shoes can give you a false sense of confidence with how you land. It can promote more landing of the heel. You'll land harder, and your feet, you want to be barefoot when you do this because your feet will kind of tell you, okay, am I landing correctly, or does that landing kind of feel like shit on my knees or on my hips or on my ankles? So he's landing pretty hard. I like to have my athletes land with their toes open, absorbing the landing. Ooh, that actually looked like a flat-footed landing. Let's look at that again. Yeah, so that's not the best. When his heel kind of makes contact with the ground. But the athletes that I work with, they're on their toes. Even on landing, that heel is not touching the floor. I want to sequence that forefoot and that foot ankle strength to be really strong. And this also highlights where a lot of strength and conditioning principles have a gap. Because they're using shoes, they can get away with less than optimal techniques with their plyometrics. And when you land with all that force that makes contact with the heel, this guy's not landing flat-footed, but he's definitely allowing his heel to make hard contact with the floor. That is really hard on the joints. That can accumulate to wear and tear over time. So we want to land on the areas of the foot that are designed to absorb force, and that's the toe and forefoot. And
What are the
yeah,
what are the pros and cons with the rebound versus the landing just landing strict on the ground? I've done it both ways, but yeah, what are they both called depth drops? Is one of them called something different?
yeah, they're both considered depth drops. There's depth drops and there's depth drop jumps.
Okay.
And the depth drops is more like an early phase stuff.
Okay.
Especially if I'm trying to teach the athlete how to land, because you're landing with more force than, say, a regular jump. And you also give a chance to teach your body to relax before the fall happens. So that's why you see how he's stepping his foot out like he's about to step off a building.
Yeah.
So the Soviets taught that to their athletes because when you step your foot out, it keeps your posture straight, and you can also emphasize some relaxation. And as soon as the fall triggers your muscles, you can absorb it and try to maintain a nice solid form through the forefoot. Keeping the spine straight, keeping the hips in place, the pelvis. So this is more like an early stage stuff, teaching the absorption. Once they're good at this, then we'll start teaching, to land, absorb, and then fire back up, either into a broad jump or into a vertical jump or something like that. Or we can kind of do like a progressive shock method, where we'll have like a 6-inch box, a 12-inch box, a 24-inch, and a 36. And they'll jump on the 6, drop down, hit up, then, and it gets higher and higher and higher. And that's a way to kind of progressively load up the athlete in their plyometrics.
Gotcha.
Now, one more detail, the primary goal is when you do depth drops into a jump, not the landing, but into a jump, you want to try to make sure, because there's a new study that came out where if the ground contact time is not within 0.15 of a second, the results that an athlete gets are very limited. So you want to be within that perfect Goldilocks space of 0.15 of a second. That's the prime amelioration phase of the stretch shortening cycle, where the body can properly absorb it and recoil it, and the muscles can get the development from it. Because if it's longer than that, then the energy dissipates into the TFLs as heat You lose all that kinetic energy.
Gotcha. How do you record it and uh, time the recording? How do you even tell how fast your contact time is with the ground?
You can record it
It's just
using like
video.
Coaches. Yeah, you can use Coach's Eye app, which can kind of break
Okay.
it down into milliseconds. But if you have a good trained eye, if you know what you're looking for, you'll know how fast it is. You'll be able to see it. It should look blurry. It should be rapid. It should be like they barely touch the ground and all of a sudden they're back on the box. It's got to be a little faster than what the naked eye can properly what can properly see.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brian McGinty has a real good example of athletes that are hitting ground contact time at around that 0.15 space.
Okay. I wanted to circle back to this too, the
Yes.
dorsiflexion jumps. You mentioned that. I've seen this video before. This guy Gunther, he's just kind of he's one of the plyometrics guys that all the trainers making reels use. But yeah, I've seen these jumps. I've wondered about them. What are your thoughts on what's your hot take on the dorsiflexion hops?
I think it's very pointless. Now, people do it because it creates a strong recoiling effect, getting more height. But this is a vertical jump test technique. Like, because I'm a big proponent of training biomechanics that are going to show up in sports techniques. So if you're constantly training an athlete, because you do get higher when you do that, because you recoil like the fascial and tendon system. It kind of like loads the spring up. You get a little bit higher. But if you look at vertical jump testing, they're doing this dorsiflexion like crazy to get as much height as possible. Now, Jake, you're a sports fan. Have you ever seen in any basketball game, any football game, any soccer game where they're jumping like that?
Yeah, both heels out in front together. No.
No, it doesn't ever occur.
Yeah.
And also, jump training is a great way to enhance your sprinting. When you're sprinting, you're extending your foot. You're like, especially when you're leaving the ground, like say your foot hits the ground and it pushes away into hip extension, your toe extends. And then your toe stays extending and it dorsiflexes up later to catch the ground again once you maximize your hip flexion. So to me, I'm not a fan of trying to push this dorsiflexion technique just for the sake of getting higher vertical jump scores. Now I understand where it comes from because the sports performance world is obsessed with hard quality scores because it's the only thing we can measure right now. We can't measure soft quality. We don't have the we don't have the technology for that. But we can measure hard quality. We can measure vertical jumps. We can measure broad jumps, lateral broad jumps, sprint times, things along those lines. And when you're trying to get someone into college, when you're trying to get someone into the pros, having a nice, sexy vertical jump score does help their cause. So I do get why they really push this technique into performance training. I just don't think it's biomechanically sound or necessarily effective for in game.
All right.
It's just a weird foot pattern. Even when you look at this guy
Yeah.
jump, like he's not trying to push that dorsiflexion, and you should allow your dorsiflexion to happen naturally. You shouldn't over. I don't think overemphasizing it is going to make you a better. It's going to make you better on the field.
The I know knees over toes guy. He does those tibius raises or anterior tibialis raises.
Mm-hmm. Is that where he's like leans against the wall and you pull your dorsiflexion up?
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
this
those
is
aren't bad. So let me
what,
let me let me reiterate.
yeah. What are it's yeah. So and we've talked about this before. Like nothing is ever bad in a vacuum. It's all context dependent. So what are like the pros and cons of this, and how does this kind of tie into the what we just saw Gunther doing with the dorsiflexion hops?
So dorsiflexion is really effective for landing. Good dorsiflexion promotes optimal landing. So the kinetic energy can flow through the leg properly. It doesn't overload it doesn't overload like the anterior segments or the posterior segments, or maybe it overloads the adductors because of an imbalance or something like that. So training. So how I previously said, Under velocity, I'm not a big fan of training dorsiflexion, like especially when you're jumping. I don't think it's really effective for making you a better athlete. I think it's more of a vertical jump test sort of thing. But for strengthening dorsiflexion in general, with those leg raises, I think those are fine. It does help. It's a little slow. If you can train it, you can do it a lot faster. Like I like to use the water hand weight for training dorsiflexion because then I can actually give it a plyometric principle by eccentrically overloading the tendons and the stretch shortening cycle of the muscles. You put the water weight onto the foot. You can do it standing, or you can do it seated, and you dorsiflex as fast as you can. Just like doing it with the wrists, with the ball work training, you can do it with the feet. I think that's super effective.
I like that.
And even what we're seeing here, a lot of this is like really good, like knee maintenance
Yeah.
kind of stuff. I like it does help to have good dorsiflexion. Like, having poor dorsiflexion has its own set of problems, especially lateral dorsiflexion is really common in higher arch athletes. That tends to be very deficient with them. But yeah, I think that's a pretty decent modality. Leaning against the wall, pulling your ankles up. You just don't want to do stuff like that. You don't want to do it to failure, because especially in the beginning of your training, like if you do this, like one of the, a lot of people call this like accessory training. If you do an accessory movement like this, a lot of guys will tend to burn the reps out into failure or close to failure. You kind of just broke down your neurological signal for the rest of your training. So your feet are going to feel slower, more tired, more fatigued because you just gassed them out and you started some small tissue fraying.
Gotcha. So then the signal be kill when you start slowing down, when you can't maintain the fast speed.
Yeah, with this, I would just do it for a peak set. Just going as fast as I can. As soon as I feel a light burn, I'm stopping it.
Gotcha. I like this guy. This is Graham. He's Barefoot Sprinter. I recommend. All right, we were going to talk about the fascial system too. This is you kind of mentioned like the hard skills, like the jump training, the vertical jump measure. This is on the other side of it. This is training the softer skills, the stuff that's harder to measure, but arguably more important than the hard skills. So, yeah, this is towel crunches, which is it's in your program.
Well, not exactly. It's being entered in my program because I had to take some time to really learn this. Because a lot of this is like relatively newer science right now. There's no playbook for fascial training, not yet. Some of us are trying to write it right now. But to kind of explain this, so there's the traditional towel crunches, which we learned in the nervous system training program, that's done in the seated position. And it does a full foot flexion. So people are going to see my feet for a second, but this is the best way I can demonstrate. Okay. So, can you see my foot okay, Jake?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you look at my foot, now I don't know the name of this flexion that this guy is teaching, and that I've seen a bunch of other coaches and athletes playing with. I've been looking online trying to figure it out. I can't find anything, so I'm just calling it a type 2 toe flexion for right now.
What specifically are you talking about? What direction is the toe moving in?
I'll show you in a second. I'll show you. So here's one type of toe flexion where you crunch the foot all the way down, right? And this is what Marv Marinovich implemented with his towel crunches, where you sit down and you roll the towel up. Now this is really good for really targeting the muscles and plantar fascia. This is more like a strength exercise onto the foot and the foot arch, which has a lot of great benefits, a lot of quality. But if you look at what this guy is doing, Coach Chong, is that he's doing a different type of toe flexion. And it's more, actually, let me use my right foot to kind of show this. So you have this type like this, right? And then you have this.
Gotcha. It's like the knuckle. You're isolating that further knuckle out.
Yeah, so I'm not hitting these knuckles that are connected to the foot. I can't remember what they're called. So here's one type of flexion, and here's the other, where I'm just hitting these secondaries in my big toe. See, I'm just hitting this first knuckle right here. Yeah. So what this is doing, So he's doing that type of foot flexion, which took me a while to figure out because I was trying to play around with this modality for like a couple of weeks, and I was getting frustrated because you're supposed to feel sensation in your glutes. It's supposed to promote what's called fascial glide into your posterior chain, and I wasn't feeling anything. You know, I was working it because I was doing it the way Mark taught. I was doing it like this, and the bottom of my feet were just burning out. You know, and like after my feet being sore for days, I was like, you know what? I don't know if this shit really works. I think this might be like a real soft quality that might not have a high return on investment. Like, I'm just going to let it go. You know, and I was getting kind of pissed. I was like, how the fuck does this work? Like, this isn't making any sense to me. You know, and I was starting to fall down this weird rabbit hole that other trainers fall down where they start getting annoyed with fascial training. They start thinking that these type of modalities are useless. You know, that it's a bunch of fucking like snake oil. It's a bunch of grift, right? Oh, is this a video where he explains it?
Yeah, this is Coach Chong's. He's got this playlist here, the Hyperarch fascial training playlist. So the first
Okay.
one was just that video we saw, which is him going over the towel. Um, yeah, I've seen a couple of these videos, but he's got a lot of good stuff. I know that you know him too.
Yeah, he's pretty ahead on the fascial understanding, you know. And this fascial system, this shit is not easy to figure out. Like I have been racking my brain around this for the past month, trying to really understand because the fascia has so many mechanisms and so many qualities, like way more than I thought. It's a long laundry list. It's a very multi-dynamic mechanism. But yeah, he's kind of demonstrating what I was talking about.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
exactly. Yeah. So there's two types of toe flexion, right? There's like he was just showing it where there's just flexing the toes and then going flexing the full plantar fascia arch.
yeah,
Now this toe flexion he's showing where we're doing it like this.
yeah,
Apparently that stimulates the fascial tissue from the bottom of the toes up the foot arch behind the heel, and it follows a fascial line into the glute. And what it does, it creates what's called glide. So the fascial tissue in your body is is kind of like it's a non-Newtonian solid that's mostly made of water. It's like 70% water, and the other 30% is just really thin tissue. You know, so imagine like a really thick, like silk sponge that's made of water, right? It's a very, very complex organ. And it can also like bend and peel away from each other, and the strands can connect and they can kind of peel away and then they can like reconnect. It's very fluid, like the texture of it. It's very strange. It's very trippy. And so what you're doing when you're doing this towel crunch, you can even do it with your hands. Here's another way to stimulate the fascial glide into your hands, like this. And you can feel it when you do this. You can kind of feel it go all the way up your arm. So the difference between this and this, when you're doing this, you're actually promoting these layers of fascial tissue to start sliding in between each other better. And that slide goes all the way up your leg and into your glute. And so here's the next interesting part. Was really difficult for me to understand because I am more of a nervous system guy. This fascial stuff is really new, and we're still learning about it because there's so many different things this fascial is doing. So there's the sliding mechanism, right? Because one thing that the fascial does is that let's say when you're jumping and you hit the ground, you're forcing your the I used to believe that it's the nerve endings in the muscle that detects the kinetic energy. It expands in the stretch shortening cycle and shoots it back up. So it detects it. You get a chain reaction of stretch shortening cycle going up the leg. Information hits the spine, rebounds. The information goes right back down. Apparently, that there's a what's the word? There's another signal that runs in tandem, that runs parallel with the signal that hits the muscles. And that's the signal that runs through the fascia. Now, the fascia encases everything. It encases the nerve endings. It wraps around the muscles. It wraps around the tendons. I'm not sure if it wraps around the bones though. I have to research that. So
Okay.
let's say when your foot hits the ground, there's a signal that goes through the muscle, through the nerve endings into the muscle, but at the same time, there's a signal that goes into the fascial system and they run parallel with each other. And they intersect at the spine and they come right back down. Now, I'll explain what that signal is doing. What that signal is doing is that's communicating to the fascia how to distribute the kinetic energy most efficiently to which muscle groups. And it will remember that pattern. That's what it's not muscle memory, it's fascial memory. Because the fascia has neurotransmitters built inside to help it communicate with the spine and the brain. So it will remember that. So let's say, real quick, can you pull up a video? This might be hard for you to find. Search like fight science. There's a really good anatomical video that shows the kinetic energy traveling through like a fighter's leg into their hip, into a punch. It just gives like the audiences a real good visual. It's like from History Channel, like fight science. Yeah, that's it, right? Yeah. Okay. So let's skip over until we find. Yeah, they had a really good animation. Now, once we find it, let's loop it and play it at half speed, just so we can it gives the audience a little bit more time. Okay, so here the signal runs up the nervous system, but you see it on the outside. Pause it real quick. Okay, so they have a really good animation. You see the nerve endings that are running through the leg, right?
Yeah.
That's the primary mechanism. That's the primary principle we're trying to target with nervous system training. Now, when it comes to the fascia, so you see the yellow kinetic energy traveling up the leg. You see how it's dispersed on the outsides of the leg, right? That's the fascial system. The fascial system is taking that kinetic energy and it's deciding where we're going to throw this kinetic energy to make most efficient movements. So if you have some areas where the fascial system is not gliding properly, it becomes dehydrated, it becomes sticky, the muscle groups are weak, it's going to automatically try to push dispersion into areas that are stronger. And it will remember that. It has it's a form of intelligent tissue. Really fucking weird. So, and that keeps your body safe. So let's say if the fascial system doesn't glide well through, say, some of the hamstrings, the fascial is going to be a safeguard so the kinetic energy doesn't overload that weak muscle groups, creating a catastrophic injury. Right? And it'll remember that over and over and over again. So what we're doing with that towel crunch is we're reteaching that fascial connection into these areas where the glide might not be working properly. And so now if you do that, you can start getting these weaker or more inhibited areas of the body, especially the posterior chain. You can make them more active. You can make the signal stronger, and you can start encouraging the fascial system to start throwing kinetic energy in that direction. So the more it can be distributed, the more muscle groups you have working for it, the better the fascia is throwing that kinetic energy in different places, the more force you can generate, especially with the glutes. Now, keep looping that a couple times, if you don't mind. So you're seeing it kind of displaced through the body, right? And think of like the insides as the nervous system, the outsides, well, technically it's all inside, but just for the sake of this imagery, through the outside, that yellow wave that's traveling across the body. That's what the fascia is doing. It's calculating and training the kinetic energy that's running through the body like a shock wave to disperse properly. Now, here's the secondary mechanism that the fascial system has. It also helps as a gel layer to absorb shock, kind of like Master Chief in Halo 2. Do you ever play Halo?
It's only at my friend's houses. It's been a long time.
Okay, so for you nerds out there, there is this scene actually in Halo 3 where Master Chief, like, he gets launched through an atmosphere and he literally falls from like fucking space and hits the Earth, and he survives it because inside his Mark III or whatever armor, there's something called the gel layer. And that helps absorb and distribute the shock throughout the body more evenly so it doesn't break you apart. And the fascia also does that. it assists in distributing the kinetic energy, while the muscles also act kind of like as an airbag. So it's like an airbag that can absorb energy, kind of like the Black Panther can absorb it and fire it back off. So you got all these different mechanisms being handled simultaneously. It's not just the tendons and muscle. This fascial system is a huge part of how we can generate force as athletes, and also how we can improve our force generation a lot faster, even faster than what Marv Marinovich was trying to do with the nervous system training. Now let's get into like fascial hydration. Now, what happens a lot of times, especially for older guys, is that the less you start doing movements that hydrate the fascia. When I'm talking about hydration, I'm not talking about drinking water. I'm talking about pushing fluid into this fibrous matrix, into this like non-Newtonian solid. And the only way you can push fluid in that direction is with kinetic energy. Because that creates a stimulation, electrical response, and the body will send fluid because you need some sort of electrical stimulation for fluid to show up. As we get older, our bodies naturally dehydrate. That's why we start looking old and shriveled up. And our joints start feeling stiff. We start developing the old man strength, and we start naturally leaning away from mechanisms and movements to keep the fascia hydrated, elastic, and working properly. And that's why we feel stiff and tight when we're older. And we call it old man strength. But it's not old man strength, it's compensation. It's your body becoming more rigid. It's overloading primaries to try to generate strength as a way to protect itself. You start turning, think of it like this. As you get older, you start turning more into the T-100 from Terminator 2, the robot
Yeah.
exoskeleton. Very rigid, very solid, very robotic. But the fascial system is more like the T-1000. It's like a liquid metal.
Yeah.
It can absorb and recall and stretch and snap and distribute. It can do all these different qualities to it. And so imagine your body is really like the T-100. You have the skeletal system, the rigid structure surrounded by muscles and bone, and it's encased in the T-1000 liquid. That's the fascial system. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's let me throw something at you since I I observed a pattern and um I only saw it a few times, but I had a few clients that were older ladies specifically, like ladies in their 50s, maybe early 60s, and they would have stiffness in like their shoulder or something like that. And um, a couple of them got ultrasounds and they had calcium buildup in those areas with stiffness. And so I was wondering if, like, my understanding of fascia and it goes with what you're saying that it can kind of shape shift from hard to soft, and like in Eastern medicine and Eastern martial arts, there's this concept of hard and soft, and so the fascia kind of ties into that well. Um, and so my theory is that like as you accumulate scar tissue, as you get stiffer, as you move less, the fascia loses the ability to get soft and it sticks harder. Calcium builds up and that becomes scar tissue. Does that all check out? Is that how does that all fit into
Now,
your understanding of it?
now the calcification is usually a byproduct of reinforcing tendon insertion, or it could be like a sign of wear and tear, like bone on bone contact, that sort of thing. And usually what keeps those sort of calcifications from building up is, a better distribution of the fascial glide. If you look at someone like Michael Jordan, I imagine he had some areas in his fascial glide, his posterior chain, that might not have been the strongest, which is why he had such thick calcifications around his patella tendons. If you look at Michael Jordan's patella tendons, there's like these big, like masses where the tendon inserts into the bone of calcification, helping reinforce to withstand the demand of his basketball play. So, and it's something along those lines. Now, I'm still learning a lot of these ideas. Well, you probably have to go to like a Google image, maybe. Yeah. So if you just pull up any picture of his knees, can I move my screen so I can see this? Yeah, and you can see like where it inserts into his shin. You see like how it's like a big lumpy like bone.
Yeah. Trying to find a good one. It's not a lot of up close pictures.
It's kind of hard to
Trying to
see,
see it.
but
Yeah.
you also see this with athletes. Did you ever have any friends that would play like football or baseball and they had like this bump on their heel where their Achilles tendon inserted into their heel?
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Okay,
I had that a little bit. I had
you had that little.
Ashkud slaughter when I was growing up in my knees and heels as well.
Yeah, so if there's an area that's taking a lot of kinetic energy, that if the tendon strength is a little lacking, the nervous system and the body will start distributing calcium in there to reinforce the insertion into the bone.
Okay.
So if you have a better fascial system, if your fascial system has a better glide, your muscle system has a better stretch shortening cycle that's trained into it simultaneously, then that will really help reduce the amount of calcification that develops around your inserts. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've thought about that a lot.
Yeah. Now, now going back to this foot reflex, right? So when you're doing these things, like we'll use my hand as an example. Now, if you look at my hand, the way you have to coil these joints, what does this kind of remind you of, Jake? Does anything pop to mind when you see my hand like this?
Um, I mean, honestly, that's Tua Tagovailoa, the quarterback. He's had a couple of head injuries where his hands curl back like that when.
Okay, that's not what I'm talking. Okay, so what I was hoping you would say is that this kind of reminds you of like the claws of like a cat,
Okay. Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
when they retract their claws and they detract their claws. Okay, so this is we're going. If people like rabbit holes, we're going the fuck down this rabbit hole because this is how my brain usually tries to process information. Okay, so when I'm studying this type of toe flexion, because Coach Chong he would show up images of different athletes that show this hyperfascial arch integration, and I'm looking at it and it looks a lot different than what I'm usually used to seeing in strong feet. Because I always visualize strong feet as in wide open hands that can grab the ground underneath you, right? Like people from indigenous countries, But if you look, he shows a lot of examples where the tendons on top of the foot are really popped out. If you see the top of my hand, all this striation, this is what he looks for. And when he was talking about that, I'm like, what? Like that's not what Marv Marinovich taught in his programs. Like that's not what I'm used to seeing. So I wasn't exactly understand what he was talking about. I wasn't seeing it. And so as I was working these reflexes, and I was trying to mimic those tendons popping on my foot, and then it was actually right after my baby was born. I was sitting at the hospital, and I was just messing around with my foot, and I bent my toes this way, and all of a sudden those tendons on top of my foot started popping out. And that's when it occurs to me, I'm like, that's it. This is what he's talking about. And then another image popped in my mind. Okay, so Google this. Google Google Raiden Metal Gear Solid.
How do you spell Raiden? Like,
Raiden. I think that's right. Maybe these nerds might correct me.
it was Raiden, and what was it?
Metal Gear Solid. So this is a character in a video game. This is how my brain works. Where this and try to look for his feet. No, we want this put in Cyborg Ninja. I know it's fucking a bunch of freaking nerd out here. I use video game references to try to make breakthroughs in sports science. Okay, so let's see if we can find a good image. Something where we can kind of see his feet. Click on a couple, see what we got. Like, I can't see it from here. You may have to try to enlarge in that. Oh no, click the one where it's So if we go one, two, second row down, second to the last. I'm going to. Yeah. Okay. Can we zoom in on the feet in any way? All right, here we go. That can work. Now you see his feet
Yeah.
on this video game character?
Yeah.
That's the same type of toe flexion. And now they're over exaggerating it with like fantasy, you know? But but that toe flexion, I remember seeing that in that video game. I'm like, oh, I was like, okay. Then I started looking at the image more and I noticed like the tendon popping, the curling of the toes. And then when I was looking at it, I was like, you know where I've seen that? I've seen that in predatory cats. Predatory cats like lions and tigers, bobcats, they have a similar structure to their hind legs.
Yeah. I know exactly what you're saying.
Right, and now here's another thing I want you to do. So do this, Jake, with your hand. Like do this form of flexion. So you tighten the skin of your palms, and you just flex your hand like this, and you'll kind of feel it get real tight across your palm.
Yeah.
Now take your fingers and push into your other hand. Do you feel how it kind of like spring loads your hand?
Yeah. And I can make adjustments. Yeah. I can make adjustments to make it spring a little more. I feel the tendons.
Yeah. So this is where I think this is where I think this fascial glide has an evolutionary root. So if you look at predatory animals, they all have a foot pattern kind of like what you see with this towel crunch. Forefoot dominant, reflexive control out of the toes. You're kind of making like predatory claws. Now, when I noticed this, I thought, hey, maybe this is a leftover evolutionary mechanism from going from quadrupedal to bipedal. I was like, oh, maybe this is like a leftover sort of thing that we can kind of tap into. And I was thinking about it more. I'm like, wait a minute. Our lineage branched off from simian, from primates, and they have handed feet, right? Their feet are like hands. Like if you look at gorillas and chimpanzees, they're like secondary hands. That's where our feet evolved from that. And I'm like, okay, so we eventually evolved it up from there. We didn't go from cats to humans. We went from, we're both mammals. We share some DNA similarities, but it seems like the biomechanically it's a different sort of structure. And that's when it hit me. Our feet are becoming predatory from handed feet. We're developing cat-like predatory feet for a primate, for a Homo sapien. Because we are able to sprint now. We're able to stand upright. We need to accelerate, which most simians, most primates don't. They don't, they knuckle walk. And so when I was looking at this mechanism more, this forefoot towel crunch where you stand, pretend it's my foot, you stand like this and you crunch, like you kind of flex your claws, that glides up into the posterior chain. If you watch a cat run in slow motion, when their feet hit and when it releases into their hip extension, their claw, this part is the last thing to make contact with the ground before it goes into the posterior chain to create that hip extension to drive them forward. And this is what this guy's talking about, how you become fascial driven glute dominant by training that reflex. You're training the predatory mechanism that's built into our feet, because we are not just prey animals, we're prey and predatory animals. We can do both. We can run long distance and we can sprint. We're aerobic and anaerobic, just like a predator. We just don't have the other physical features built in, but we were starting to develop the feet that you see in predatory animals. Does that make sense? So you kind of following me?
Yeah. Yeah. This is interesting.
Right? Like I was like, this makes total sense. But here's the thing about heel striking. Our heels make contact with the ground. In other animals, especially predatory animals, their heels don't make contact with the ground. Their heels stay suspended.
Yeah.
So our heels make contact with the ground because everyone is big into like, oh, heel pressure equals glute activation. Yes, this is true, but it's for a different purpose. When you walk, or maybe when you lightly jog, that heel pressure creates rigid strength to brace your body into the ground contact. And that's why we dig our heels into the ground when we stand. We don't stand on our toes. We put our heels down because they act as like crutches to the rest of our posterior chain. It's like an anchor. It like anchors us down into the ground, and that's why our heels are kind of heavy, because it's literally pulling our posterior chain into the floor, making a straight line, holding us upright. But when we run, the heels have to elevate. And then, so what we want to do is we have to re-encourage the fascial glide to still interact with the posterior leg chain without the heel making contact. And not everyone has that mechanism really well refined. Not everyone has predatory feet. Usually, very advanced athletes, in the NBA, NFL, they usually have that, and that's what it means to be more fascial driven. The predatory mechanism in the feet is more refined. The toes, we scrunch it to improve the glide. And so we have more muscle groups working with us as we run, making us more powerful, more force, more speed, like a predatory animal. And so we have to retrain that because we're capable of both. Now you mix in wearing shoes all the time, sitting all the time, and now we have a population of people that have lost their predatory engagement. Their predatory mechanisms are atrophied. They're shutting down, and we become quad dominant. We lose force. So I'm putting together a whole ebook that explains all of this, and it's like I said, it has been very complicated for me to understand. Usually, I can understand things very quickly. This is like I've met the edge of what I can understand and what I'm trying to learn. It's kind of like trying to understand outer space. When your brain kind of like can't quite wrap your head around, gravity or
Yeah.
whatever the fuck.
I think that our culture and especially Western culture is kind of missing some concepts, missing some terms to really tie it all together. It's like how when um, when Einstein came out with his theory of relativity, there was only like three people in the world that could understand it, and then like 10 years later, it was like every high level
Everywhere.
physics person can understand it. And now it's everyone who just tries to understand it. It's because it's our culture has kind of caught up to
Hmm.
to that being an underlying understanding.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, so this is where I'm at with it. This is as far as I've gotten, and I'm trying to put it all together. And I'm coming out with a new ebook to explain all of this, the fascial system, the mechanisms, how it works, evolutionary standpoints, where it comes from, how it improves sports. Like this is it's taken me a while to really figure this out, but I always look at things like I don't like to look at things from an anatomical, well, not anatomical, but like a medical science perspective because the terminology is too confusing for me. I can't learn it all that fast. So I always just study nature because we're animals too. We're animals just like every other animal, and all their biomechanics, all their mechanisms, we can look at and observe and use logic to determine how this is working within us. So this is where I'm at with like the fascial system. And since I've implemented this, I've been doing this with the hands. I've been trying to experiment new modalities. This can add a whole nother layer in addition to the training protocol because I'm following Marv's philosophy. Learn everything you can, experiment. The things that seem to work well, high return on investment, that now becomes a part of the program because that's all the nervous system training is an accumulation of some of the modalities that work the best, most efficiently, and the fastest, and it's all kind of smashed together.
Yeah, let me ask you this one question. So when something is right, when it makes sense logically, what is it? Do you have like does it feel a certain way? Does it feel like smooth, fluid? That like does is there like a feel component when one of these methods that you try experiment with kind of rings true? Um, is there like a physical compass that you have to kind of steer you in the direction
Oh,
of like functional or unfunctional?
100%. It's a two-part process. There's the information that I try to learn, like from like the internet, the AI language models, textbooks, whatever I can get my hands on. There's that information, but I also know all the answers are in my body. My nervous system can communicate the answers with me if I can come up with the language to interpretate these feelings, these sensations. And so that's why I use analogies like crazy, because I don't exactly have a grasp of the language, nor do I think maybe all the science has the proper language to identify all these soft quality enhancements that some of these newer mechanisms have been able to be recently measured. I'm talking the past like 5 to 7 years, we've just been able to figure out some of these ideas.
I would argue
So
that some of the science might even have terms that kind of make it harder to understand these concepts.
yeah, yeah, they do, you know, and I really got onto this when like there was this one guy who was like, I guess he's a chiropractor that was trying to criticize sports performance, which I thought was kind of interesting. But there's this guy that was talking about, it's like, yeah, I went down the fascial rabbit hole, and you know, it's all a trend, it's all bullshit. Like there's no medical science, there's no information that shows that the fascial system has any output, you know, when it comes to like triggering the muscles or force generation or anything like that. So, and I was like, huh, okay. So I researched what he was talking about, and he's right, but he's thinking about it all wrong. It's not about output, it's about input. We do not output sports movement, we absorb and recoil sports movement. And a lot of people aren't understanding this because they're thinking about it like a robot. You know, robot pushes action, a car drives forward. You know, we're thinking mechanically, we're not thinking organic. Like, I remember my bouncy ball analogy, like a couple episodes back.
Yeah.
Our ability to absorb the kinetic energy and fire the kinetic energy off, even when we punch, absorb and throw. Even with this jumping, even before she left the ground, there's an absorption into a launch. Like, replay this video real quick and I'll show you. Everything has an absorbing and a launching effect. Nothing is just static into output when it comes to sports movement. So go from the very beginning. You'll see her load up. You see how she kind of loads and then releases. Everything has a absorbing and recoiling phase to it in sports movement, and everyone just focusing on is the output, the recoil part. They're not focusing on what causes the recoil, the absorption. You know, so another, you know, think of Black Panther. His suit absorbs the kinetic energy and it can store it and release it later. Our bodies do the same thing, but it just has to do it at 0.15 of a second. We can't trap the kinetic energy like his suit can and save it for later to punch someone in the face.
Yeah, it's this whole nervous system training is very eccentric based. It's one of my buddies was trying to do a box jump one time. I just told him think about the landing. You know, um, the
Well,
jump will just happen.
every sports movement, every movement at velocity is eccentric dominant.
Yeah,
It's not concentric dominant. So that's another reason why I think injuries are really high, especially in sports like basketball, because everyone is focusing on how high they can jump. No one's focusing on how well they can land. Majority of these injuries are coming from landings or overloading foot movements, like these Achilles tendon tears. They shoot the foot back. That's a huge eccentric overload. Eccentric overload is too high. The tissue strength can't handle it. It ruptures it.
yeah.
It overloads the tissue. The force is too great.
I've heard this fact twice, and I haven't fact checked it beyond just hearing it. But I've heard that the number one predictor of ACL strength is depth drop height. Like the higher you can depth drop from, the lower your risk of ACL tear. Um, which
I
makes
don't know.
sense.
I don't know if it could be that simple because ACL tears can happen from a multitude of different variables. Like especially internal external rotation. If your internal external rotation is severely imbalanced, weak on one side, that
Hmm.
can really compromise you for an ACL tear. But you could also have great jumping mechanics because it's not kicking in those deep six rotator muscles as well. But in some
Yeah,
cases, I don't know. I should look into that. I'm kind of
it's.
curious.
I'll
I
look
don't
into
know
it
the
too.
exact.
I think it might not be a direct correlate or like a causal link, but it I definitely
Could
think it's like the more eccentric strength you have in your lower body, the lower the injury risk.
yeah,
Un,
that's on. No,
yeah,
yeah, that could be more like a hard way to measure it.
yeah. Like the same way you can use grip strength as a measure for longevity. It's not a direct correlate, but it's
Indicator.
yeah, exactly.
All
Yeah,
right.
affected by similar factors.
All right. Well, yeah, that was my whole fascial rant. That's where I'm at with this, and I'm pretty excited to keep going down this rabbit hole and adding this to the program. I think it's gonna be freaking awesome. I'm really
Yeah,
excited for the benefits myself because I'm having some freaking fascial gliding issues up the ass, literally. So I
yeah,
gotta fix this.
yeah. I'm excited too. That's I can say a lot of people I've talked with coming in through your program are into the fascia. That's part of what brings them in. So excited to see this ebook, and we'll keep building off of this in future episodes.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, thank you everybody. Like, comment, subscribe, drop your questions, and we'll get to them in future episodes. Adios for now.
All right, see you guys.